Being critical in your literature review. We are required to be very critical while exploring literature. And the literature review is actually on the basis of your critical thinking and your critical approach. So researcher is always very critical. And there are strategies to adopt for being critical and to come up with a very critical approach, right? So the approaches are like you must be comparing and contrasting different approaches, different theories, right? And you would be coming up with the pros and cons of different themes and different approaches, different theories, right? And that's actually the aim of literature review, that you are to provide the background knowledge. So the background knowledge is basically about the theoretical perspective, right? So you must be comparing and contrasting. Then you would be using a very strategic and selective, approach for referencing to support your arguments, okay? Because you are required to think and decide that which point would, support your own argument, right? So for your arguments, you need support. And for support, you must have, critical thinking. You must select on the basis of your critical thinking, right? So, and that critical thinking is always very strategic, right? Then we are also required to synthesize various kinds of information. And then on the basis of that synthesis, we are required to reformulate the arguments, okay? So that's the quality, that's the ability required from researchers to synthesize and to reformulate the arguments, okay? So that's also the required from a very critical researcher. And then you would be, while exploring literature, you would be agreeing with some of the points, okay? You would be confirming some of the, ideas, some of the opinions, some of the studies, some of the models, right? And you would be defending some of them in your literature review because you are required to find out, various points and various point of views, okay? So these are the points which are required from a researcher. You would also be evaluating, you would be assessing the strengths and the weaknesses of a point of view, right? So that is also based on your critical approach. So a researcher is very, critical while exploring literature, okay? You may also be rejecting some of the points, okay, which are to be found in literature, right? And the rejection is done on the basis of very solid grounds, right? So you must also be in a position to reject, but with evidences, okay? And that's actually to be reflected in your literature review, okay? Then the additional points are also related to literature review tips and literature review techniques. Those additional points include, like for example, you are required to mention that why did you select certain works, right? From certain sources, from certain databases. At least to justify your own position as a researcher, you must go through a very consistent system, okay? Then you must be being very critical, but being critical does not mean that you are required to demolish each and everything. You must be agreeing and disagreeing. That's the requirement from critical approach. But at the same time, you should be doing it in a very logical way, in a very reasonable way. Then the negative critique is acceptable in literature, but the negative critique should be, for constructive use. For example, if you are negatively, critiquing, you are actually providing some critique just in order to show a gap, right? Because that gap is to be filled by your own study. So if you are unable to create that gap, you may not be a very good researcher. So you would be providing negative critique, but that negative critique should be used in a very positive manner. And then if you are to provide negative critique, it should not be personal. It should be in a very respectable, very respectful way, right? And it should not be in any case personal. You can disagree with opinions. You can disagree with, theories and findings, but you should not comment on personalities. You should not be providing any negative critique about persons, right? So you can negate studies, you can refute studies, you can challenge some of the studies, but at the same time, you should be very respectful, and that is required from a researcher, particularly when you are exploring literature for the sake of constructing your literature review.